Hi, I'm Joe.
And I'm Liz.
This is Joe's Table, where we talk about role-playing, game design, hobbies, project planning, world building, and all things creativity. Also spreadsheets.
Yay, spreadsheets.
Which is not this episode.
Oh.
Made you look.
Shucks.
No, today, see, that self-demonstrating article. Today we're talking about the information economy in role-playing games. See, what I did there is I trapped Liz. I made a trap, and I lied. Because traps are lies, and that's bad. Don't do it. Anyway, this one might get kind of soapboxy because I have strong feelings about this, and I think Liz does too. Mm-hmm. But just to kind of give you like the 1,000-foot view, when you're playing a role-playing game, you need information, right? I think one of the definitions of playing a game is to make decisions based on information that you have about the game. So if you don't have information about the decisions that you're making, then you're not fundamentally playing the game. You're just guessing, right? Then it's basically just random chance.
And that's a great way to get your players really disinterested if you're running the game, or, as a player, just to completely check out if you don't get the information you need to keep the story advancing.
Right. Done.
Cool. Wrap.
So yeah, the point is players require, in the mathematical sense of require, information to play the game. You can't be a GM and tell the players exactly nothing whenever they fail a check. That's just it's just not going to work, right? And that's kind of the thing that we're going to talk about in many different paths today.
Yeah. And this is something we've seen come up a lot. Certain systems, this occurs a little bit more, and then others. Some systems have actually specifically addressed this type of situation. But, we see it happen when somebody fails a skill check and the response is just, yeah, okay, cool. You don't notice anything.
Right. That's a very, you hit the nail on the head right there, is that it does happen a lot, especially in traditional games, by which we always mean games that inherit from the D&D tradition. But it happens a lot with notice checks and kind of investigation type things where the plot and continued progress of the game hinges directly on whether or not the character finds out information. And then if you give them a check in that situation, you're basically saying there's, a 50-50 chance that you could fail at this, and then the game just stops because there's no way for you to proceed, right? At that point, what we tend to see is that the players start reaching around and trying to say okay, can we go back to a different thing? Can we go talk to this other person? It really destroys the sense of forward motion of the game.
Or it can lead to some really paranoid behavior and metagaming. Right. Because the GM asked me to make a check here, so there must be something. Right. So I didn't see anything, so I'm just going to be paranoid for a little bit. Right. That there might be something lurking in the bushes, out there. Or, other behaviors like that aren't really going to pull the game forward to the point you want them to go. And
we've I guess... I'm going to try not to get back into D&D too far into this, but I've heard a lot of GMs, famous GMs on YouTube talk about how they like to have fun with the players by asking for rolls, like notice rolls or whatever, randomly throughout their game to kind of throw the players off. And I'm not big on that. I'm very small on that because that indicates that there's meta information in the game that you're not willing to concede. And that, I think, is sort of problematic to the way players make progress in the game at all.
Yeah. And I also think it's just such a missed opportunity too, because there are other systems that handle a failed roll a lot differently in a way that actually makes the game more interesting and can move the story along. So when you take a look at it to say, okay, yes, you failed the roll. So yes, you noticed the, werewolf that was coming to attack you, but, then you put in some sort of a
Right.
Penalties. So they still notice what was there, but they notice it too late.
Right.
Or they notice it when it's already chewing on their leg, or, something like that. Like, that's already a more compelling, interesting thing to have happen.
Or that they find werewolf poop.
Yeah.
Or, like, that's one of the things that I like to do a lot, is especially with notice rolls and investigation type stuff, I frequently give out hints on failed rolls. Because what that does is that says, yeah, you didn't find the thing that you were looking for. And sometimes I'll even give them like hints in a different direction to follow, like, so almost red herrings occasionally. And then let them kind of try to suss out where that information leads and what that means. Because now they're still playing the game. Mm-hmm. Now they're thinking like, okay, well, what does that mean? I thought we were looking for a werewolf. How come there's like fish scales? Ooh. Did the werewolf, is it a were-mermaid wolf?
Ooh.
If so, maybe that's how the mermaids get from lake to lake. I don't know. Like, so that turns it into a very, like, it can keep the players' minds very interested in what's happening, instead of saying, nope, you didn't find anything. Right? Like that, there's no story there at that point. There's no game there even. Like, if the player's goal was to go find the werewolf in the woods, they go to the woods and they don't find a werewolf and they find zero anything, then like you're putting them in an impossible in an impossible position, because now the players are like, look, it's our job. We accepted this thing to go find the werewolf. There is no werewolf. We failed objectively. Like, now we can't do anything, right? You're
just punishing your players for the fact that they had bad dice rolls, which doesn't help anybody.
Right. That's not really fun. That's just unnecessarily simulationist, I guess.
And very frustrating as a player.
And very frustrating. And since we are both very narrativist, we much prefer a situation where hints are given on failed rolls, especially where we're talking about information rolls. Where again, this isn't. You can have plenty of rolls that this is not applicable to, like attacking somebody in combat. If you miss somebody in combat, it's not bad game design for them to just not do damage to that bad guy, right? Like that's just sort of how it works. What we're talking about is information and like the story of the game. You're not losing information when you fail to attack somebody, but when you go to investigate something and there's no information there to be gathered, then it's like, oh, well, okay, I guess we don't keep playing the game,
Cool. I'll just go back to town, back to the inn, and have a beer.
And discuss how we failed to find the werewolf or whatever. And then that, that stops being a game until the GM is like, okay, well, the werewolf attacks the tavern. And it's like, well, why couldn't we just have the thing continue to, like, why couldn't the story just keep going? The other thing that kind of happens when the GM fails to give the players enough information is that you can get these weird situations where the players are unaware of what's happening in the game because the GM is essentially using the rules to lie to the players. And that sounds really harsh. And I know it sounds harsh, but let me elaborate. Like, basically what you can have is the situation where the GM pays too much attention to the way the rules work at the expense of the fiction making any kind of sense whatsoever. So you might have like an example might be like an invisible creature that's like attacking somebody, and then the GM says, well, you take 20 points of damage. And the player's like, why? Or the player maybe doesn't even ask why and is just like, geez, okay. I try to escape or whatever, right? And like they don't gain any information about what happened to them, which is completely unrealistic, because how does anything hurt a person without them understanding where they're hurt and like how they're hurt? You know what I mean? Like it's just nonsensical. So like you can't have a creature being invisible and like doing that kind of stuff without the players gaining some kind of information about that. And that's only one specific subset, but like that same kind of thing of like maybe they get attacked from a creature that's hidden in a forest or whatever. And it's like, well, you take 14 points of damage. And the players are like, from what? Well, I don't know. Maybe the only thing the GM says is that it was piercing damage, right? Yeah. They just happen to let that slip, but they don't say that there's an arrow stuck in their side or anything. That's not cool. That's not good GMsmanship, because you're not giving the players the information that they need to even think about the game world. You're just saying you're losing the game, right? And that's not how the game ought to be played, basically.
Yeah, and now your players are just frustrated and disinterested and like flailing around or running away because they don't know what they even can do in those situations.
Right. And it's basically the same kind of behavior as rocks fall and everybody dies. It's just kind of GM fiat. The game works the way I say it does.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm going to have a brief side note on chopping people's arms off here. This is more of a D&D specific thing, but it's more applicable to like traditional games where there's just a hit point pool and the damage doesn't have specific consequences. This kind of stuff also happens in kind of a positive direction. I mean, in a more information kind of direction, especially when the GM gets really into describing how the damage works and says, like, for example, the dragon bites Al's arm off. He takes 20 points of damage. In D&D, like nothing, like he took the 20 points of damage. That's all that happens. Like there's no, he can only use one arm rules mechanic there. So there's kind of a disconnect there too, in terms of the information that is given to the players.
And I think that leads to a very different sort of play feel. Whereas in D&D, if I'm playing a D&D character, like I don't care how damaged I am because there's no penalty to it, except for, I might, get knocked out or die or something like that. But if I keep wailing on the bad guys, like, cool, I might be able to make it through. And there's no consequence to doing that. But in other systems, there are consequences worked in where, maybe it's subtracted from your roll, so your roll is going to be diminished now that you've taken damage. And the best that you can get is, -2 off of your rolls, which really gives you that consequence to think about, do I want to go into this fight or not? Or should I heal up?
Right.
Is it safe for me to go forward? Or, systems like Apocalypse World, where there's a 1-to-1 exchange of damage every time you get in a fight, very different sort of a feel, and very, clear consequences to doing something like that. So there's other ways that can be done. I think it's also, and, once again, this is a traditional game, setup. It's also kind of disheartening for players in a way, or at least I feel this way, when you're, sitting there wailing on the creature that you're attacking in a fight, and you've given them a ton of damage, and the GM might be describing that, but you're not feeling any result of that coming back at you. You may have given them enough damage to chop off their arm or their leg, but they're still completely able to come after you and attack you just the same, as they were at the beginning of the fight.
Yeah, in traditional games, characters are basically immutable until their status changes. And sometimes you have abilities where you can change their status directly, like a spell that causes paralysis or whatever. Now their status has changed and their experience of play is completely different. But yeah, it is very strange. It leads to a very strange kind of feeling where, and I've seen this happen a lot, especially in modern games, where there's sort of this kind of bravado of players where the player will act like their character is completely fine until they have like zero, until they're taken out, until they're like dead on the ground and bleeding out. And they're like, I've heard the phrase, whoops, I'm out a lot, right? Where it's like, there was no indication at all that character was suffering at all until they lost that last hit point, at which point they promptly drop dead. And everybody's like, oh, I thought that guy was okay. Right. And back to your point about like the GM can say that the bad guy is hurt, but nothing mechanically happens. The GM doesn't have to say that the bad guy's hurt either. Like there's been plenty of times and plenty of campaigns that we played in where the GM, and I've done this as well, I'm sure, where the GM just doesn't give you any feedback as to the status of the creature. Because the D&D, like especially in 5th edition, there is no bloodied state. There's no mechanics that say you have to say like how wounded this creature is, right?
Yeah, and as a player, you're sitting there, once again, wailing away on this creature, and you have no idea if you're actually doing a good job or not, unless the, GM is conveying that information to you and telling you what's happening with that. Right,
which is technically meta information, I guess, because the rules don't say that you should be doing that, right? There's no mechanism for which you to learn that information aside from just the GM saying this is what the creature looks like.
Yeah.
it's a pretty weird gap for a game that's mostly it's like completely based on combat.
Yeah, definitely. And it's weird to feel that that's a meta thing, because that should be one of the things that you, as a character in a situation, like if you're hitting somebody, you'd see that they're getting bruised or, woozy or something like that.
Or that bones are coming off the skeleton, or scales are coming off the dragon.
Right. Yeah. You're going to notice those things. So it's kind of strange that that's actually not something that's kind of worked right in to a lot of systems.
Okay. So to circle back around to some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier on, specifically regarding traps, there are some traditional modules that are basically completely predicated on this behavior, which is, I guess I don't understand why people enjoy these kind of adventures so much. Maybe it's just because of the pure gamist approach of them. But yeah, there are modules, specifically things like Tomb of Horrors, and others that rely on giving you exactly zero information and being exclusively about traps and stuff that you are not told about, and how you can essentially juice the GM for information, which is just kind of a surreal situation, because like a lot of that stuff is sort of is meta information. It's not built into the way the mechanics of the game work. So you're kind of like feeling around in the dark, trying to figure out what the dangers even are before tripping some trigger somewhere and then getting annihilated for apparently no reason. And I don't like that. I don't think that's good game design personally. I don't think it's fun for the players to be fumbling around in the dark and not have any control over the situation. I can see how it would be exciting, but like that's like horror movie exciting. That's not tabletop role-playing game exciting.
And I feel like that may be more fun for the GM than it is for the players. Like the GM is going to get a whole lot more out of that situation.
Yeah. Because if the players are going to keep playing, then like they have to come up with more characters. So those players are not playing anymore. They're making new characters or whatever.
Yeah.
That's I would encourage you not to run your games that way, because I think that there are probably fewer players who are going to enjoy that kind of situation. Because like fundamentally, think about this. The story of D&D is not a story of idiots who stumble into a dungeon, right? They're supposed to be heroes. They're supposed to be the main characters of their story. It's very rare that you have like a heroic character that feels heroic, that fucking stumbles into everything successfully and only succeeds through sheer luck, right?
The bumbling idiot sort of hero.
That's funny. It's not exciting.
Yeah.
Right. So if the players are like trying to have a heroic moment and like the only ways that they succeed are through sheer luck, it's not the same thing. It's not going the way that they kind of signed up for. It's against the social contract, basically.
Yeah. So let's wrap up with some ways to avoid this problem and some different things that you can do to really keep your players invested and involved and keep the game moving forwards as you go through.
Good idea. So, in some games, as we've touched on, specifically games like Powered by the Apocalypse and Fate, you're absolved of a little bit of this, some of the issues of part of this problem, just because the game itself builds in situations for failures. It's not a fundamental nothing happens on a failure. It's fundamentally something else happens on a failure. Traditional games tend to be nothing happens on a failure. But Fate and Powered by the Apocalypse games, those have like either a choice that you can force the players to make, or sometimes just bad things, but specific things happen to them, so that it's not like nothing happens on a failure. Sometimes it's even bad things happen on a failure, which then puts them in a different mindset. You can also, even in traditional games, you can describe the damage. That'll help a little bit. You can describe the things that are occurring in the game. That's not against the rules of D&D.
Yeah.
Please do that. If you're running a game and your players seem like they're floundering a lot, just describe the situation that they're in more, because chances are they just don't know enough about what's happening to them in order to make a good decision.
And another thing you can do is if you have a creature that has multiple attacks, say a bite plus a claw attack, and your party has done a bunch of damage and you've described that, they've hacked off the arm of this creature. Well, then switch to only using the bite attack. So there's other ways that you can work with that in certain systems to still have some consequences to the damage, but still allow you to keep going and keep your fight functioning.
Right. And if you're competent enough as a GM, you can do a lot of like in the moment skinning of things. Like imagine you've got like a minotaur that has a big two-handed axe swing that he'll do. So normally he like attacks with one hand with his axe, but occasionally he'll do this big overhand power attack. If one of the characters you've described them as lopping off his arm, and he just kind of phrased that he can't do his power attack for a little bit, and then if you do need that power attack back, just because that's what the rules say basically, then you can always say like reskin that attack to say that he picks up a giant rock and slams it on people or something, or that he basically just throws himself onto the bad guy or onto the good guys or whatever.
Or headbutts or something like that.
And then just change the damage type as necessary or whatever, and then keep rolling with it, right? Another thing that we want you to do to mitigate this is give the players hints. If there's a room that's like, if you're going into a dungeon, give them some kind of information that there might be traps there. A dead body on the ground with a spike sticking through it that's coming out of the wall. Blood splats on the ceiling for no apparent reason. That kind of stuff makes it more fun, even when there are traps, because now they're like, now that there's real paranoia and it's accurate paranoia. Now they're like, we need to be careful about this, right?
And you can even throw in some red herrings in there too, so make it look like maybe there's a trap that's now dead and broken, or has expended all of its darts or something like that. But you still create a really interesting situation where now your players are like, oh crap, what's around that corner?
Right.
Should I check this more closely?
Right.
And
or they're like, they'll say, look, I tried to look, but I didn't do a good enough job. Does anybody else want to take a look? Right.
Yeah. Ratchet up that tension just a little bit, rather than being like, yeah, no, room's fine. You're okay. Oops. Sorry. You just got,
That's just punishing the players for no reason. That's not storytelling anymore. Yeah. And I remember an excellent example of this in the Margren campaign. One of the first places that you hit as a group was a temple that was full of yuan-ti, and there were holes in all the walls. And I think you kept checking for traps wherever you found these holes. You had the rogue kept checking for traps. And it was a red herring the entire time, because it turns out that that's how the snakes moved through the building. And it turned out there was a big like pond or pool of snakes or something, like a snake reservoir essentially, that you found later. And you're like, oh, okay, that's where all these snakes have been coming from. So then it became kind of an interesting like foreshadowing moment, kind of a call forward, and then a call back. And it was an interesting way to make the place seem like it had some story to it.
Yeah.
Even though that wasn't actually even a trap.
Could have fooled me.
And it did.
Yep.
So one of the things that you could also try is, and this is a little bit more rules bendy, but in some games, especially in things like Fate, you will find that sometimes on a failure, some games will give you an option to succeed, but at a cost. Frequently, the GM is in charge of giving you the decision you have to make, but it's usually like a very sadistic question. Choose between saving your friend or catching the bad guy kind of situations, right? It's usually not that big of a question, but like drop your weapon or succeed at your attack, kind of things. And you can totally do that in traditional games too. If you're having trouble kind of making the failures feel interesting, especially if you've got characters who are failing a lot, then you can kind of give them those options. Or if if you're not even talking about roles, you can still give them these kinds of like, well, we did not succeed at getting through the door. Do you want to bull rush the door and take 10 damage, or not try to bull rush the door and turn around and go some other way, right? Like those are ways to make it more interesting instead of like, say, you just don't succeed.
And it really builds up tension too. As a player, having been faced with a lot of those tough choices, it that's a lot you have to think about then to say, okay, so I really want to get this goal done, but I now need to make a really tough choice.
Right.
And that choice could have some big, serious consequences for me or for the party or, for this NPC that I'm, dedicated to or something like that. It really gets you very invested in what's happening with that failure, which I think is really, really unique rather than, oops, I failed. Okay, cool. Let me try again or let me do something different. Like, to think like, yeah, I could succeed here, but at what cost?
Right.
And I think that's a very real world sort of a thing to do too. So.
It's very dramatic too. We like drama in narrative style role playing.
Yeah.
So back to the fundamental point as a wrap up, give your players information when you're playing the game. As a GM, don't try to hide things from them that they need to continue forward. And you can hide like who the main villain is and stuff like that that's gonna change the way the story progresses, but give them enough information to keep the story moving at all times. Don't put them into a locked room and tell them that there is no key and they can't proceed forward. Right? That's just that's right. They stop playing the game, and I think what you want is for them to continue playing the game. Don't forget, players need information to play the game. That's really all we wanted to say this time. Please give us a hint.
Simple message, big payoff.
Yeah. I'm Joe.
And I'm Liz.
This is Joe's Table signing off. See you next time, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Peace.